Introduce myself. My name is Dr. Bob McBride. I'm the superintendent of Lockport Township High School District 205. And I just want to spend a moment before we bring on really onto the main stage our Kids Matter partners and then our speaker this evening, Dr. Eric Weiner. And maybe just to kind of frame why in the middle of this pandemic, when we know that there's so much going on with health, so much going on with student mental health, why in the world would we be doing a webinar about marijuana, vaping, and e-cigarettes? About 5 years ago, I was principal of a local high school, a very large high school, and we brought a guest in named Dr. Kevin Sabet, not Dr. Kevin Sabet, but Kevin Sabet. And what made Mr. Sabet unusual was that he was the drug policy advisor to the Bush administration for 8 years and then the Obama administration for 8 years. And we brought Mr. Sabet on to speak to an auditorium of about 800 parents about the topic of legalized marijuana, the coming of it, which is now a reality in Illinois, and vaping and e-cigarettes. And one reason why I want to tell that story is because at that time, in this auditorium full of people, his presentation wasn't really well received. Mr. Sabet predicted that with the coming of legalized marijuana, what that would mean is that the availability of marijuana, legal for an adult population, would increase its availability for an adolescent population. He wasn't really there to comment on adult use or make a right or wrong comment, but just to say that parents should expect with legalization of marijuana, it would be more available, much like we've seen with alcohol, because there would be more of it in abundance. And certainly that has been something that we've seen in schools with marijuana that is both inhaled and marijuana that is edible. But like I said, he was not very well received at the time. Parents really thought that his thinking was old school or maybe puritanical. And somewhere I remember in that presentation, his message of being thoughtful about what this would mean for adolescents, not for adults, thoughtful what it mean for adolescents got lost. Similarly, he made a presentation on vaping and e-cigarettes, where he predicted that there was so much we didn't know about the manufacture of these things, the sale of these things, the marketing of these things that could potentially be damaging to adolescents. And now we know just so much more about vaping and e-cigarettes and about what it can do both to the health and to the mental health of students. Why am I telling that story? Well, as Dr. Maya Angelou said so eloquently, when you know better, you do better. And it is certainly true in this pandemic that student mental health has been front and center in a time that we're all feeling it's more difficult to cope, move forward, face our day. In the fall, we partnered with our partner, KidsMatter, a non-for-profit that we respect and has helped us so much this year with social emotional learning, to survey all of our students, well over 3,400 students. And there was good news in that survey. The good news was only 6% of our students said that they were actively using some kind of substance. That was the good news. The bad news that within that 6%, 79% said that they were using marijuana or e-cigarettes or vaping to reduce stress. That's probably not such great news. And we were really struck that of those 79% of that small 6%, almost 97% of them said that they were using marijuana. And that really was a signal to us that we need to continue our education here for you as parents, because one of the things that we should be looking for in this pandemic as students look to cope is looking at their use or their potential use of marijuana, vaping, and e-cigarettes to relieve stress, and helping you have the tools to address that in your own home and recognize it in your own home. So here with me, I want to introduce Kamala Martinez. She's going to tell you a little bit about Kids Matter. We've had such a rich partnership this year. And then also just really hope that you enjoy Dr. Aaron Weiner, because I think he's going to have things. I'm going to enjoy this as a parent myself. I'm a high school parent as well. So Kamala, could you take over?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. McBride, and thank you for inviting Kids Matter tonight to be here. For those of you who aren't familiar with Kids Matter, we are just a prevention-based organization who focuses on the overall health and development of kids from their social, their emotional, and their academic well-being. Our mission is to build resilient kids who simply say no to destructive choices and yes to endless possibilities. Simply put, we just want kids to be successful in life. We serve over 250,000 youth and families throughout our events and programs annually every year throughout DuPage and Will County. And tonight it's our pleasure to be here to have Dr. Weiner present the e-cigarettes, vaping, and marijuana session. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Weiner, who is the board certified psychologist and owner of Bridge Forward Group. Dr. Weiner also has a private consulting practice. He earned his doctorate degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and completed his fellowship in addiction psychology with the VA Ann Arbor healthcare system. Prior to forming the Bridge Forward in 2020, Dr. Weiner served as the director of the addiction services at Linden Oaks Behavioral Health in Naperville, Illinois. And he was also the founder and clinic director of the Spectrum Health Addiction Rehabilitation Program in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He has spoken nationally on topics of opioid addiction, marijuana commercialization, and the vaping epidemic, as well as served on been a content expert on many policymaker and media outlets. In addition to his work in healthcare systems, Dr. Weiner is an adjunct professor in the consulting psychology department at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He has served on the board of the Society of Addiction Psychologists and won multiple regional awards for his commitment to converting best practice ideas into real-world change. Please won't you help me welcome Dr. Aaron Weiner. Dr. Weiner.
Thank you so much, Kamala, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, and before we even really dive in, I just want to give a quick disclaimer that I am also a parent, and you will probably hear evidence of this tonight, as it is right around bedtime, and there's some energy in the house. So just putting that out there. We'll try to stay on track, though, but if you hear barking, if you hear happy kids, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. But thank you all for taking the time this evening to join us. I'd like to talk to you about e-cigs, vaping, marijuana, what you need to know in order to have impactful conversations with your kids. Because the through line through a lot of what I like to talk about is that I want to make sure that you can leave here feeling like you can do something. Knowing things is helpful, learning things is helpful, but doing things is better. So we have a really ambitious amount of content I'm going to try to give to you tonight in a short amount of time. So I'm going to move quickly. I put my email here in the bottom left of the slide. So please, if you have questions that we're not able to answer tonight, reach out to me. I want to be a resource. I'm happy to provide the source material from what I'm citing and so forth. One last thing before I dive in, just a quick word to the panelists. I'm hearing some rustling, so I think someone's mic is probably not muted. So please go ahead and check that. And with that, let's dive in. We're going to start with e-cigs and vaping. So specifically, what are they? So for those who are not aware, it's a device to heat a substance and release a chemical. Anytime you're trying to get a chemical out of some substance, you have to release it somehow. So you can chew it up and have it be absorbed through the stomach. You could light it on fire and smoke it. Or in the case of vapes, you can superheat it, but below the point of combustion in order to release that chemical. Now, the idea here is that it's not as bad for you if it's not on fire, which, there's some potential truth to that. It's true, but it still doesn't mean that it's okay to do from a health perspective. And we'll talk about that in a minute. They've all got about the same general layout where you've got haft, where you've got the battery. Some of them allow you to adjust the resistance in ohms. The less resistance, the faster it heats it up. A different experience of vaping. The one you're looking at here is they're either open or closed systems. The closed ones have cartridges like Juuls that you throw out. They're also just disposable ones that you throw out when you're done. This is one where you can see that it's got a tank called the Clearomizer, where you would put in the liquid, otherwise known as juice, in there that then gets titrated up to the heating coil at the top through these wicks and then heated, and you inhale. Some have an on-off switch, some completes the circuit when you inhale automatically, but these are the basic anatomy of a vape. Now they do come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and then also types where you can also vape THC concentrates, and even the flower as well you can vape. We'll talk a bit more about marijuana in the next section of the presentation, but basically the big difference is that you've got the ceramic heating chamber instead of a place for liquid. If you've heard of dabbing, that's when you take these extremely potent THC concentrates and you put just a dab of them, like you see here, on that heating element, and it heats it up so that you can use it. One of the big issues right now is that we've got this perfect storm of a trendy delivery system in vape pens and the most harmful formulation of THC, that being these concentrates, which are immensely potent, combined with the legalization of marijuana, which has normalized the use, gives a permission structure for kids to use and a lot more access. And so we're already seeing huge spikes in vaping, and I think I've got a slide on that coming up. Oh, it's the very next one. And I expect this to continue to go up, unfortunately, over time. So this is from the 2019 Monitoring the Future study, a national study. And you can see that this big chunk of red is all about vaping. Nicotine and marijuana, 8th, 10th, and 12th grade. What you're looking at there is that so 35% of 12th graders say that they've vaped nicotine in the past year, and 20% say that they've vaped marijuana in the past year, according to this data. We have another national level survey that's found about the same thing, potentially depending even a little bit higher. So it's unfortunately really catching on. This is another way to visualize this data. The one I'll draw your eye to is this high school e-cigarette use, this red line. And you can see that particularly 2018, 2019, it has just tremendously accelerated. And we'll see, hopefully, there was a damper on it in 2020. Hopefully, COVID helped put the brakes on that. We'll see. We'll also see how it rebounds after things go back to normal. But in terms of vaping, it's worth knowing how we got into this mess, because it informs, in my opinion, the way out. So Juul played a major part in this. And at this point, I think we're all very familiar with Juul. They've made a vape device that is, it's got these cartridges that you put on top. They're disposable. Each one has about the same amount of nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. And they used to come prior to quite a bit of government action in a bunch of different flavors. Flavors have been a huge driver of vaping and building a vaping audience. And Juul went right along with all the rest of the companies. What happened was that they just exploded in terms of market share. Here's Juul market share from 2016 to 2018 in the e-cigarette market, and look at everything else. I mean, virtually nothing is growing except for them. They were absolutely dominant before there's, again, started to be some legislative action we'll talk about. Now, part of the reason for this is that they were the first to use what are called nicotine salts. And what nicotine salts do is they deliver a nicotine hit to the brain that's stronger than regular cigarettes. This is taken from their great Reuters investigative journalism article that I pulled this from, but this is part of the Juul patent application. And they were absolutely aware that if it was a stronger hit to the brain than cigarettes, that it would very easily attract kids, that more kids would use this potentially even than cigarettes, because not only does it have that stronger nicotine addictive hit, but it also comes in flavors, which actually have been banned in cigarettes since 2009. I think I've got a picture of that coming up. But so they've got this competitive advantage with the kids because they can use flavors while cigarettes cannot. And they always said that they didn't want kids to vape, but their actions were not in line with their words. And the Truth Initiative back in 2018, great organization, highly recommend that you follow them on social media. They did a study that found that 16 out of 17 Juul users were teenagers. And so if you think about this from a business point of view, if 16 out of 17 of your customers are, under the age of 20, then it doesn't matter if it's supposed to be 21 and up, or you say that you don't want kids to use. If that happened, you would go out of business. And in fact, actually, what we've seen most recently is that Juul has suffered tremendously, bearing the brunt of, it's actually reaping what they sowed. They had this coming, but they've really taken a huge hit with some of the changes in the market, as well as a lot of lawsuits. Now, as I mentioned, the reason why we don't see these flavored cigarettes anymore is that we know that flavors attract kids. We always have known this. It's no different for vapes. Juul went right along with everybody else. They had 2 tobacco flavors, 6 non-tobacco flavors, that were a lot more appealing. Again, they are not the only ones to do this. This is a photo from the Vape Wild website where you can buy things with names like birthday cake and rainbow crunch and zebra striped gum. And again, like if you ask yourself what sort of flavors, who's attracted to these flavors, it's not it's not like a 55-year-old, right? They're not the ones who are like, ooh, birthday cake flavor. That's not what they're looking for. It seems to me to be pretty transparent, but there's deniability here, right? Because there's nothing inherent about zebra stripe gum that has to go to kids. Adults can use it too, right? But the issue is that actually when you look at who uses these flavors, it's disproportionately kids. This was a study done in 2019 looking at changes over time and what kids prefer. And you can see fruit has always been popular. Menthol and mint has actually been growing in popularity. Candy or dessert, a little bit less. And then here's other. And that means tobacco. Tobacco is other. And so when you talk about like who would a flavor ban actually impact, it would absolutely be aimed at kids. Because if you're looking for like a smoking cessation tool that hasn't been validated by the FDA, by the way, you don't have to have a blueberry vape pen in order to use vapes if that's what you're really after. You could use a tobacco flavored one. That is very possible. And then their launch campaign. These are the ads that they used in their launch campaign. From a great article, you can read about it in the New York Times, to jewel lure teenagers and get customers for life. But again, these models don't really look like 45-year-old chain smokers. They look like young people or the people who teenagers would be looking up to and wanting to emulate. And this was absolutely on purpose. There was if you Google Mass Gen Juul lawsuit, you'll find this document where the Massachusetts Attorney General in 2020 filed a lawsuit basically saying, oh no, Juul, you knew exactly what you were doing in terms of hooking kids. It is it is a page turner of a legal document. I'll just put it that way. And this is just part of it, right? These are two of the models who were also included in their launch campaign, images that were included. Again, who are they targeting here? But this is a very familiar line of advertising in the modern age, because you go for social media influencers and you want to try to market after a culture, essentially. So like there might be people who look here at Lucas Sabat, who is still a social media influencer, but at the time was at most 18 years old when Juul worked with him. And people might look at him and say, I want to be like him. This is cool. This is how I want to be. What are the things that he wears? What are the things that he does? And so when he posts that he uses Juuls, you're going to be more likely to do that. And there's been a lot of examples of Juul doing this. It can sometimes, again, be how kids want to identify what they want to look at, or explicit marketing like this, where, again, if you're trying to hook a 65-year-old on your product, you're probably not using this imagery, right? It's just not what appeals to that market. It's not how you brand, it's not how you do it. But again, plausible deniability, right? Anyone could do it. And they would do a lot of very shady things as well. There were kids who provided testimony to Congress back in 2019 that they went into a 9th grade classroom and called this device totally safe. They spent over $200,000 on social media influencers because it works. And I've got a couple studies here. I'm not going to read this off to you today for lack of time, but basically, yes, if kids are exposed to e-cigarette content and ads, they are more likely to use e-cigarettes. And that's what these two studies are looking at. Again, happy to send them to you, but shouldn't come as a shock that advertising works, but advertising works. Now, part of how this does work is that it reduces the perceived risk of using a substance. The more you normalize something and the more you make it seem harmless, the more people who are going to use your product. This is something that the vape industry has used, has absolutely taken advantage of, and the marijuana industry has too. If you think of phrases like about vaping, for example, where they say, oh, it's just like nicotine and water vapor and flavoring, and there's nothing bad in there. Even the word vape, right, sounds like, vapor, like you get off of like, I don't know, a hot tub or, off the top of a boiling pot, as opposed to an aerosol, which is actually what a vape produces. But aerosol doesn't sound quite as harmless. So that's not the term that was pushed. It makes a tremendous difference though. What you're looking at here are two graphs that show past month binge drinking on the left and past month marijuana use on the right. And then whether or not that was done depending on if the kid either perceived a great risk in that behavior or anything else, moderate, slight, or no risk. And you can see here that twice as many kids binge drink if they don't see it as a great risk, and about 15 times as many kids smoke pot if they don't see it as a great risk. And that again, if you are in the business of selling these products, you absolutely need to pay attention to this, because young people are your target audience. Most of the revenue from addiction for profit industries comes from people who are addicted to your drug or substance and are using it every day. And 90%, I think I'm spoiling a slide from further on, but 90% of all addictions start before you hit age 20. So if you are in the business of addiction, of course you target the young. You can't say that you're doing it because that is a problem, but of course that's what you're actually doing. And again, that's part of what I'm going to try to show you today, is what's actually going on here. Now, why people vape, there's a lot of reasons for it. Again, people tend to view it as natural or healthy. It's easy to change doses if they're trying to stop smoking. For adolescents in particular, the flavors are huge. One study found 85% of kids said it was because of flavors. They feel like it looks cool, it's trendy, it's been marketed. As you saw from like Lucas Sabat, it was, it's been, the manufacturers have intentionally linked it to quote unquote cool people in popular young person culture. Of all ethnicities, by the way. I know Lucas Sabat is African-American, but there's plenty of social media influencers who are white, all nationalities where they've done this. It also provides an entry into a social group or identity, which is really big for kids. So when you are trying to fit in high school and you're trying to form your identity, drugs have always been a social equalizer, because it doesn't matter if you are smart or funny or articulate or pretty. All you do is you put the substance in your body and you're part of the group. And that has a tremendous draw. Or if you had a group of friends and they've drifted in this direction and you don't want to lose them, there's a lot of pressure to go along with it. So when the use rates of these products are so high, it puts a lot of social pressure on young people to be part of it. It's also very easy to conceal the use compared to particularly to cigarettes. Low odor, no smoke. They can use it in the bathroom. And of course, we see this a lot with young people, or discreetly in a classroom. So just very quick crash course here in vaping history. It was invented 2003 in China, introduced to the US in 2006, but it's generally produced. There were very few regulations exist. It's only been in the last month or so that vape companies have been required by the FDA to submit their products for review before they can sell them. And even then, people are, I'm going to show you a slide about this in just a minute, are finding loopholes. There's essentially a law that says for tobacco products, you have to have it reviewed by the FDA before you sell it. Well, what if you're getting the nicotine from theoretically non-tobacco sources? Then you circumvent the FDA again. We really need better legislation around this. Adult use, though, of e-cigs is very rare and less than cigarettes. So only about 10% of adults have ever used a vape device. Only about 3% on average currently use it, and most of them are also smoking cigarettes. So they're not just doing one or the other or completely converting. Many of them are doing both. Now, in terms of the health impact of this and why we care about this for young people, I'm drawing my information here from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. They did a fantastic literature review on this a couple of years ago. Really thorough. You can look it up. It's a free download, actually, but great aggregate of current strong literature. What they found was that there is conclusive evidence that in addition to nicotine, most e-cigarette products contain and emit numerous potentially toxic substances, including heavy metals that may come from any number of different places in the process of vaping, unfortunately. And there's substantial evidence that the components in there are capable of causing DNA damage and mutagenesis. So DNA damage and mutagenesis is what causes cancer. So while we don't have the direct one-to-one vaping to cancer link, we do know that vaping causes the thing that causes cancer. So if you give it some time, it's going to get there, right? It's just, it hasn't been around long enough to see that. What are these chemicals, though? There are a bunch of them. Berkeley Lab found 31 different toxic chemicals. There's some of them there on the right. Here's some of that are specifically carcinogenic. You've got our heavy metals there, like in lead and nickel. There's nicotine down at the bottom. And one I want to really highlight right now is there in the middle, the formaldehyde. Now, a lot of times kids will, vape companies will purportedly say what's in their vapes, which again, you can't entirely believe. But even if you could, like for example, Juul says, doesn't say they have formaldehyde in their e-liquid, in their juice, but but then you still find it in the aerosols. So the question is where and how? Well, the answer to that is that when you superheat a chemical substance, it tends to degrade. And when it degrades, it turns into something else. And formaldehyde is actually a byproduct of superheating propylene glycol, which is one of the two main liquid bases of vape juice, the other one being vegetable glycerin. So when the propylene glycol gets heated up, it decomposes into formaldehyde, which is what you do end up inhaling into your lungs. So not only do you not know what's actually in there, but then you don't know what it's going to break into when you superheat it and inhale it. It's a compounded issue, and it's a major, major problem. And it led to the E-Valley outbreak, which we'll talk about in just a second. There is substantial evidence that they are addictive, which should come as no surprise. Now, very briefly about E-Valley, you might have heard about this when back in the early 2020, kids, and mostly kids actually, but people were being hospitalized entirely due to vaping. 59 people died, 2,600 got sick. We actually had the very first death in the world because of vaping here in Illinois. Now, what you should know about this is that about 80 to 90%, depending on the state, of cases were from THC vapes. Now, that said, that still means that about 1 in 10, 1 in 8 was from nicotine. The culprit for a lot of this was found to be vitamin E acetate. It's, vitamin E is okay to eat. It's okay to rub on your skin, not okay to inhale. That's how most things are. You can do a lot of things with them, but inhaling them is very bad. This was the case for vitamin E, and what it did was it basically created oil in the lungs, which then killed essentially the spots that it hit, severely damaged the spots that it hit. But the vitamin E acetate was primarily found in THC vapes. For the ones that were nicotine, it was all over the place. So it was really, honestly, very ambiguous. We're still seeing some trails of this today. The issue is mostly solved, and so we're not seeing as much as we used to, but it's worth mentioning as well that 1 in 6 of those vape products that caused E-Valley came from a dispensary. So that's something as well, that when we're talking about vaping THC, there was just a study that came out a week ago that found that kids who vape THC are, I believe it's 3 times more likely to complain of wheezing and rattling in the lungs and other lung-related symptoms compared to kids who vape nicotine and kids who vape, or even kids who smoke. Vaping marijuana was the only one that was causing those issues. So there's so much we don't know about vaping, any substance, but in particular, again, this intersection between THC concentrates and vaping, really unfortunate. This was, again, some of what we saw images around the E-Valley outbreak, where people were sick and some of them were dying. And it was not a good situation. So hopefully it's something that kids took to heart, although again, we're waiting to see 2020 data. So particular concerns for children and adolescents, as in addition to the fact that it's just harmful to them to be addicted to this and on the lungs. There's conclusive evidence that if you drink it, inject it, or even get it on your skin, you can have really severe medical issues. And if you do put it into your body directly, like drink the vape juice, it could literally kill you. Highly concentrated stuff. Don't want it around young children. There's also substantial evidence that it's going to increase the chance that they're going to smoke at some point in the future. That is a huge deal because that number, actually, there was another recent Truth Initiative study that found that kids who vape are 3 times more likely to start smoking than their peers who don't. And that is incredibly important because I don't know if you guys know the rate of what happens once you start smoking, but it's actually really disturbing. Only 4 out of 10 people who ever smokes, they will never quit. 1 out of 5 people will never quit, no matter how hard they try. And of the people who are smoking, 66, 2/3 of them will die from smoking. If they're smoking. So that is not a pipeline that you want kids to get into. It's a really destructive way for them to go. And more proximally, in terms of time, or temporally, I suppose is the better word for that, it makes you more susceptible to COVID. Vaping does. We had a study out of Stanford that found that. Another study, I'm not going to go through all the details here, but basically it primes your lungs. What vaping and smoking does is it makes your lungs, basically softens them right up for COVID, so that when you get it, you're much more likely to have a severe reaction. So I believe that the rate actually was 7 times more likely kids were to get COVID if they were vaping than if they weren't, and then also more likely to have a severe case. Not good. So given all of these concerns, what is keeping us here? And the answer there is money. Whenever you see things, particularly around drugs, around addiction for profit, going in a direction that doesn't seem to make sense from a public health standpoint, is because there's a lot of money on the table. But particularly with kids, it's how can people make money off of kids and vaping? Because again, remember, 16 out of 17 vape users are teenagers. So again, there's a lot of duplicative stuff. There's a lot of oblique advertising efforts, but at the end of the day, that's what this is about. Now, a lot of us got hopeful back when there was talk that there was going to be a flavor ban, but what ended up happening was that it got tremendously watered down. And I want to talk to you a little bit about why, because this is the system that we're living in right now around addiction for profit. So they argued about the economic benefits of the vape market, and of which they're basically saying, look at how many people are employed, tax dollars that are coming directly from this. If you do a flavor ban, it's going to take away so much money. We can't afford to do that. They said, well, why are we taking away all flavors, right? Well, what about the adults who need that blueberry vape? What do you want? It's going to drive them back to smoking, right? I think that's actually coming in a second. And another bullet, but they were talking about government overreach, like you can tell them what people you can put in their bodies. Again, this harm reduction, we have just FYI, if this comes up, there are so many FDA approved ways to actually stop smoking. Vaping is not one of them. We have not actually found that to be the case systematically yet. But even then, someone can absolutely use a nicotine flavored vape if they want to switch to vapes, particularly when we see the collateral damage that happens with kids. And what was also interesting was that there was an argument made about political cost. This was actually pushed out by the Vaping Trade Association. There was a hashtag for I vape, I vote. But they literally showed this graph looking at the number of vapors in swing states and the election win margin in 2016 and said, basically, you don't want to tick these people off. This could have severe consequences if you do that. Which again, doesn't really matter the party in power. It's convincing for a lot of politicians to see numbers like this. They don't want to be on the wrong side of something that's so close. And so what happened was that there were a bunch of loopholes in the flavor ban. In particular, what was exempted, the only thing essentially that was taken out was Juul, these cartridge-based flavors. They did not take out disposables, ones that you just use and then throw out after they're done. They're still cheap. A Juul pod is like $4.25 a pod. The disposables are like $7 each, so a little more expensive, but not prohibitively so. So those were exempted. And then also those just freestanding liquids were exempted as well. So you can still get flavors in those different ways. And so the disposables were what came on. So it was Juul faded out, these faded in, and you have all these different brands. I'm clearly doing exactly the same thing with Banana Ice and Lush Ice. Pink lemonade, pineapple lemon, again, what are they going after here? It's pretty clear. And this was, again, Puff Bar in particular was the dominant brand. Now what happened, because they attracted so much attention, was that the FDA actually, this is from a vaping news website, was FDA ordered Puff Bar off the market along with a few others that were essentially breaking tobacco product rules. And then when you went to Puff Bar's site, this is what you saw. They've ceased all online sales in the US. There was no website. But, and you might have seen this, not 2 weeks ago, this is very recent news, they're back. And how are they doing that? As I mentioned, they're now claiming they have tobacco-free nicotine. And because they're doing that, they're saying, well, we're not governed by tobacco laws. Therefore, we can do what we want. So they're right back with pomegranate and grape, blueberry ice. This is why we actually need real solutions to this. There's people who, they just want to make money. They just want to make money off of our kids, to be perfectly blunt about it. They know exactly what they're doing. We've done this with cigarettes again for decades. So Puff Bar is back. If you go to their website now, this is what you'll see. I actually pulled this screenshot out today. So the fight continues. Another example of a disposable that last time I checked was still on the market. Even after Puff Bar was taken down, Stigs were still there with their Mighty Mint and Tropical Mango. So again, and you look at, there's a 3-pack for $20, right? So it's not hugely expensive. Some kids actually even like these more because if they need to throw one out, it's not like it's a big deal and they're not throwing out their vape device. And as I mentioned, you could still get these. All those flavors are still out there. So I want to backtrack for a second to link into the marijuana part of tonight's presentation and talk about where the vape industry came from. And specifically, or rather the Juuls in particular, they weren't made by just like scientists who are trying to get older people off smoking. The makers of PAX invite you to the Juul launch party. So who's PAX? PAX are people who make marijuana vaporizers, and they did for years, particularly before it was legal just about anywhere. So basically, people who made illegal drug paraphernalia were the people who invented and created Juul. And if you look at it, it looks a lot like the PAX era, doesn't it? Yeah, it's a spin-off company. So let's talk a little bit about marijuana and why it's particularly bad for kids. And these things are all linked. You might have also seen this in the news that Altria, who actually now owns the majority stake in Juul, just bought into, I don't remember the company, but they bought a billions of dollars stake now in pot as well, because all of this is linked. There's a lot, if you look behind the scenes, a lot of the same players: alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, addiction for profit. That's what they do. And it's just kind of different clothing for the same concept. But let's talk about cannabis specifically and about why it's a very bad idea for young people to use it. First is it's an increased risk for addiction. And I want to highlight here that I'm saying increased risk. I'm just blowing past the spurious debate that marijuana is not addictive. 150% marijuana is addictive. There's zero debate about this in medicine, in addiction medicine. It is the most common substance we treat in drug rehab behind alcohol. It is the most common substance we treat for adults, and for kids, it's second. We have a physical withdrawal and tolerance syndrome, a hallmark of addiction, if you use it enough. And it's like alcohol, where it's not like you use it for a month or you're using it in a light way, you're going to get hooked, like maybe you would with potentially like cocaine or methamphetamine or heroin. It works its way into your life like alcohol, socially, and to cope with your problems, and then you're using it every day, and somewhere along the way your body starts to crave it. Just like there's no debate about the fact that we know alcohol is addictive, we know that marijuana is addictive. If you hear otherwise, it's usually because either people are trying to justify their actions, they're trying to push through a legislative agenda, or they're going to make money off people thinking that it's not addictive by lowering the perceived risk. But kids are at increased risk for addiction because their brain is not done developing until they're 25, and or even later, depending on the studies that you look at. The last part to develop is the prefrontal cortex, and it's this blue part in the very front that stays pretty blue as we go along there. On that age arrow. Why that matters is that your prefrontal cortex is where your personality sits, and it's also where your executive functioning sits. That's the part of your brain associated with things like planning, synthesizing abstract thoughts, task switching, motivation, being able to just do a lot of things at once and multitask well, or as well as one can. And those are all things, honestly, that are useful and critical, really, for functioning, but also for avoiding addiction, because addiction's kind of sneaky, where for a lot of substances, when you first use it, it might actually even feel good or have some moment, short-term reward, but you have to be able to string together a lot of consequences in order to see the true damage. So if you're not playing with a full deck, and your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, that puts you at greater risk of falling into this trap, which is, again, if you're in the business of addiction, you know that. The rate of addiction for adults with marijuana is 1 in 10 who use it regularly, and for kids is 1 in 6. Now, what also leads to increased addiction is the potency of the products. And this is another area that has exploded over the last couple of decades. This is not Woodstock pot. This is a very different product. These are concentration data from the DEA, what they were seizing from 1995 to 2018. You can see here that in 95, this blue line, the THC content was about 4%. And that's what it was all the way back to Woodstock, 3 to 4% THC. And you can see that as the industry kicked in, as they did selective breeding of plants, that they've basically bred in the THC and out the CBD in most of the strains on average. And actually what's being seized off the street is in many cases, according to this, even weaker than what we find in dispensaries. This is a study that was just released about 4 to 5 months ago, looking at the strength of products sold in marijuana dispensaries in the United States. Then you can just see from glancing at these pie graphs that just about the whole thing is green, which is over 15% THC. That cutoff, by the way, is in Amsterdam, where they draw the line between a hard drug and a soft drug, 15%. The vast majority of our products are over that. And in fact, the average in states that just have medical programs is 19%. And in recreational, that's here, 21.5. So to put that in perspective, if you are using today's average recreational pot, it's like lighting 7 joints up at the same time that you would have gotten at Woodstock, 7 at once. And the concentrates can be over 90% pure THC, no joke. That's 30 times as strong as Woodstock. This is, again, completely different universe in terms of strength of the product and the potential negative ramifications on the developing mind, which we will also get to in just a second. So in terms of negative academic and vocational outcomes, again, we're going to go quickly through this. I thank you for sticking with me. I know so much information, it's just hard to know what to take out because I think it's also important. But in terms of what we know, in high school, at least, the lower grades, higher dropout rates, increased school disciplinary problems, maybe social functional, maybe cognitive, or both. So what I mean by that, with cognitive, we'll talk about the brain in a second. Social functional means if you are hanging out with the people who are smoking pot in high school, that is probably not the same group of kids who's out late studying for their history test at the library. So you've surrounded yourself by people who are less likely to achieve. That actually makes you less likely to achieve or to engage in those achievement promoting behaviors yourself. We know that earlier use of marijuana leads to worse outcomes and greater frequency leads to worse outcomes. And we know that the same general thing happens in college. We also know that when people report retrospectively on how much pot they've smoked in their life and how much money they've made in their life, that we find there's an inverse relationship. The more pot someone says they've smoked, the less money on average they say they've made. Now, in terms of what it does to the brain, this is really disturbing stuff that, again, we're going to have to go through quickly, but I want to make sure I highlight. So marijuana can physically change the structure of the developing mind permanently. I mean, just that's a true statement. Now, what you're looking at here is a study that put together a lot of fMRI data from different studies, a meta-analysis. And so for each of these lines, the gray part of the line says that for that brain structure, they didn't find a structural change by marijuana use. Blue means they looked at that structure, did not find a change, but red means they looked at the structure and found a structural change due to marijuana use. Now, this top row is looking at dosage. And I'm going to pull out my magnifying glass here so we can see it a little bit better. But I want to highlight those two right there on the left and right. The hippocampus on the left, that's the part of your brain associated with learning and memory. They found 85% of studies found that there was a structural change to the hippocampus. And the prefrontal cortex, they found, that's PFC there on the right, 45% of studies found a structural change by dosage. So again, these high potency concentrates, really, really bad news. Now down here lower, it is looking at duration. So this is saying doesn't matter how strong it is, just how long are they using it? Then you can see the percentages in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex are lower, but they're still there sometimes in some of these studies. So it doesn't matter even how strong it is. It just matters that they're using it for a long period of time and it can permanently impact the brain. Here's another brain study looking at the effect of marijuana use on brain aging. And what they found was it accelerated brain aging second only to schizophrenia. at 2.8 years. Here's another study looking at cognitive functioning over time. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to dive deep into this, but the bottom line is that in all 4 of these areas, they found that the red line, which is the marijuana use condition, highest marijuana use condition, was on the wrong side of the curve from the blue line, which is no marijuana use, in 4 different cognitive areas. So it follows that if your brain structure is changing, it might also then change how you can use it. But we've got the data there to support it as well. We know that it increases risky sexual behavior when your judgment is impaired as a child, and we've seen that for not just alcohol, but also marijuana. And we know that it can actually cause psychotic breaks, and that increases with a higher percentage of THC. Now, this is critical to understand that this is not reefer madness. This is not moral panic. This is replicated, peer-reviewed scientific medical research over and over again. These studies keep coming out. The one I'm citing here came out in 2019. It made national news. They found that they were looking at 11 different sites across Europe. They found that your chances of having a psychotic break increased by 50% if you smoke pot, and by 500% if you use the concentrates. That is huge and extremely disturbing. Another study that made national news around the same time was that emergency department visits for marijuana tripled after they legalized it in Colorado. And it was for 2 main reasons. One are those psychotic breaks. The second was something called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. That's when you basically can't stop vomiting because you've taken in too much THC. And it literally can kill you. I just pulled this headline off of USA Today a couple of years back, this one was, but this was a 17-year-old who vomited himself to death. He dehydrated himself because of marijuana. So one of those tropes you hear, marijuana never killed anybody, not true. And this isn't the only case like this. This also is not counting the data that just came out that showed that when you mix marijuana with a kid with a substance use, with a mood disorder, they are 3 times more likely than their non-marijuana using peers to commit homicidal behavior. All cause mortality goes up by 70%. It's really bad news, but it does hurt people, and it absolutely could kill people. And drugged driving is a huge, huge issue. Briefly, it makes a difference. Long story short, sometimes people think that it's just going to make you drive slower and you're going to be fine. No, it actually impairs your ability to drive a vehicle. Briefly about being a gateway drug. This is another place where people say there's some debate about this. There is zero debate about this, and I'm going to try to explain why in our lightning round today. So you're looking here at national data, looking at past month marijuana use, yes or no, for few different variables. You can see all the bars are pretty lopsided, but here's the one for illicit drug other than marijuana use. And you can see that it's literally 10 times as high. This is a study that came out in 2017, looking at the chances you're going to develop a new addiction to opioid painkillers if you don't use pot versus occasional use and frequent and very frequent use. It's clear, right? 5 times higher here from no use, 8 times higher here. And I want to note occasional use of marijuana in terms of the odds over a 3-year span. This study just came out about 6 months ago, looking particularly at an urban cohort of color of young people, saying, what are the chances that you're going to develop an opioid addiction? Here's low and non-users. Unfortunately, so even low, right, or non-users, 8.3% chance they're going to develop an opioid addiction down the line. This is a long-term longitudinal study, but take a look here. Young adult onset, so that means using between 18 and 25, just if they start then. Here is if they start when they're an adolescent, so 12 to 17, limited use. Look at the difference. That dark line, that 8.9%, that's heroin alone. That's 4 times as high. And look at chronic use in adolescents. Off the charts if they're chronically using marijuana as a kid. We do not want young people using the substance. We do not want to normalize the use of the substance to young people. We do not want to teach them that this is a way to have fun, that this is a way to relax, because those messages, they trickle down. And just like we're seeing in other parts of the country now, we're going to see use rates increase. It's not good. 92% of people who use heroin use marijuana first at some point beforehand. Now, very briefly, What does it mean to be a gateway drug? Well, what it means is that if someone walks up to a kid who's never used a drug in their life and they say, like, say it's even their best friend, and their best friend walks up and they're like, hey, I've got a bag of heroin. You want to tie off and inject it into our arms? That kid would be like, no, I don't want to do that. There's no way they say yes, right? Because the perceived risk of that is really high. No one starts with heroin. But now imagine instead that best friend came over, and instead of it being heroin, it was vaping or vaping THC. And they're thinking, oh, well, it's just a plant. It's legal now, so it must be safe. Isn't it medicine anyway? Everybody's doing it. Not such a big deal. And then they do it. And now they're identifying, one, with breaking the law because it's illegal to do under 21. And they're hanging out with people who use recreational drugs, which means you are much more likely to come into contact with bars of Xanax, lines of cocaine, Norcos maybe, opioids, and then you might really like that, and then eventually you'll move into heroin because it's cheaper and it has a stronger hit, and then eventually, and then you might snort it first before you. There's a progression, guys, and literally what a gateway effect means is that you open a gateway to progress. No one starts, if heroin is step 4, nobody starts at step 4. You have to take step 1 to get to step 2 and step 3. That's the way that it works. Now, again, youth are the target demographic for this. Here's some current practices. These are pictures out of Denver, although this one down there in the bottom right, that's here. This is from Illinois dispensaries. This is what's being sold in Illinois dispensaries right now. The lollipops, the chocolate bars, the Chiba Chews, that's all here. That is all here. And I want to show you this really quickly as well, how it's branded. I'm going to pull up a website. This is from the dispensary here in Naperville, the Compassionate Care Center, which, by the way, was selling this stuff well before it was recreational with the same names. But if you look at the names of these products, you can see 707 Headband, Blue Cheese, Durban Poison, Alien Rock Candy, Flow, Bio Jesus, Ghost Train Haze, Grape God Bud. Again, this was named this even before they got their recreational license about 2 weeks ago. OG18, that stands for Original Gangster. It was the winner. Their advertising is the winner of the High Times Cannabis Cup. This is not how you market to 65-year-old women with multiple sclerosis. You know what I'm saying, right? Who is this speaking to? You could call this stuff anything, right? Advil, you would have no idea what Advil did unless somebody told you what Tylenol did unless somebody told you. You could name this stuff anything. This, just like flavoring, this is on purpose. And we also don't talk much about the fact that vape concentrates are flavored too. They also come in flavors. That's even harder to regulate at the federal level, though, because marijuana is still illegal. So saying that flavors are illegal in any legal product, they can't do that. So layers of difficulty. What we know from monitoring the future is that 1 in 4 12th graders said that they would either try pot or use more if it were legalized. So this is what we're living right now. This is what we're living right now in Illinois because of what we decided to do. This is a study came out in 2019 that found, again, that if you use e-cigarettes, when we talk about progression, you're 3.5 times more likely to use pot than your peers who are not using that. So the last section I want to talk about today is what can we do about it? Because that is essential as parents to be able to work with your kids in a way that can make a difference. So the first part is stay connected and know the signs of use. So if you don't know what normal is, it's hard for you to know if it changes. So make sure you've got a baseline, but then watch for these things. So in school functioning, you're going to start to see changes there, maybe more truancy, missed appointments or homework, fewer extracurriculars. You might find that in a peer group, old friends have started to fade away, and maybe you're not meeting, they've got new friends, but you're not meeting them, or they're almost like they're trying to keep them from you. Make sure you're on their social media, watching what they do. The vast majority of drug deals happen on their phone. You definitely need to be on their phone. You might have saw about 3 weeks ago, a talk show host, Laura Berman, her 17-year-old son died of a drug overdose the very first time he'd ever tried drugs. He ordered them from Snapchat. It was delivered to their house. He thought he was getting, I think it was like cocaine. It was laced with fentanyl, and he ended up dead. So Make sure that you're on social media. It's not a safe place for them to be without supervision. In the family, you might start noticing strained relationships and avoidance behaviors. They might be more moody than normal, breaking curfew, those sorts of things. In terms of things to watch for in their personal appearance and habits, you're looking for a decline in hygiene, burns on the fingers or lips, dilated or rather pinpoint or red eyes. For marijuana, it's the red eyes. The pinpoint eyes is more for opioids. Long sleeves in warm weather can hide track marks if they're injecting heroin. If their wardrobe is changing, what are they communicating? Kids communicate with their clothes. So if it seems like they're trying to cater to a different subculture, and that subculture is very much enmeshed with substance use, take note. If they either have too little or too much money, so if they're either buying substances or reselling it. There's a lot of small-time drug dealers in high schools, and you might, if it seems like your teen has things they shouldn't have or has more money than they should have, that could be what's going on. If they're making secretive phone calls, if you see changes in their sleep habits or energy, if they seem to have the munchies or sudden appetite, unusual smells or an overuse of scents and gum or mouthwash could be another tip off. Additionally, if they're asking to go to the bathroom a lot, that could be a sign that they're vaping in there. So for substance use, multiple areas in that list are usually impacted. It's not just one. That's part of what that separates it from just like a behavioral health problem. Concealing substance use also takes considerable time and effort, and it has to come from somewhere and impact the rest of their functioning. So that it's good if you look for it, if you're attuned to your child, you can probably tell if something's going on habitually. So if you know what normal looks like, you'll know when it changes. So other things to keep in mind: provide pro-social activities and peer groups for your children to identify with. This is critical. If they are surrounded by a social ecosystem that's permissive or even promotional of substance use, they are far more likely to use than if they're not. And this goes, by the way, both for their peers and then also the adults in their life. There are some households that are very permissive. There are some communities that view it just as normal that people are using substances. That absolutely rubs off on the kids. They notice that. Also, consider if you've got a young person who's struggling with this, to reward positive behavior rather than just punishing poor behavior. So what I mean by this is that sometimes, particularly if there's behavioral problems, we really zero in on the negative and say, like, don't do this, punish, punish, punish. And while absolutely there need to be boundaries and you need to help them understand that there are consequences to actions, at the same time, if they continue to kind of like blow through your consequences, that's because there's a benefit. The purpose of that behavior, they're getting something out of that means more to them than whatever you're punishing them with. So if you want them to change, not only do there need to be firm boundaries and consequences, but give them a reason to work with you. Try to make sure that if they do things that you want them to do, come home for curfew, do their homework on time, negative urine drug screens, if you're drug screening a child, which I think is coming up in a couple bullets, but that's something absolutely that can be done as a matter of course, not about necessarily that you don't trust, but as a way of denying. So if you're drug screening your child, for example, they can then say no more easily, like, I can't do this. My parents are crazy and they test my urine. That actually can be a way out of tricky scenarios as a preventative. But the behaviors always serve a purpose. So making sure you understand the why is really important. If it's social, if it's numbing out because they've got an emotional burden, you have to know why, or you're not going to be able to get them to change. As I mentioned, have access to the phones and mobile devices, and consider home drug testing depending on your child and the situation. If you feel like there's a solid chance that this is going to happen, I know some families that just talk to kids about it early. Like, when you're a teenager, we're going to start doing this once a month just because it's going to help you make your way through. And it's kind of like we're doing right now with opioids and pain clinics. We're not telling someone that they're going to use or buy things off the street or anything. It's just what we do for everybody now. To try to stop all what's going on with the opioid epidemic. You can frame it in that way too if you want to. So we are at the end of this crazy whirlwind hour, and thank you again for coming along. But to sum this up, and happy to take questions and go past the hour if we're allowed to do that. Vaping and marijuana are both chronically misunderstood. It's not an accident. There are very rich people trying to get richer at our kids' expense. From a health perspective, nobody should vape if they aren't already smoking cigarettes. So there's heavy metals, carcinogens, they are addictive. It's far from a benign substance, and it's particularly harmful for youth. So again, don't believe what you hear, would be my recommendation, or look into it for yourself. It's not harmless, and particularly for young people, can be very damaging to the brain. These extracts and concentrates are the most harmful formulation. It's something, if you see your teen doing it, really important to try to get them away from that as soon as possible to avoid the worst consequences. And staying connected, the most important step that you can take as a parent, know what normal looks like, know the signs of change, and then be ready to step in and try to help shape their behavior in a more positive way if you start to see those signs. So thank you again for following along tonight. There's my email if you want to reach out. You can find me at weinerphd.com. I am very active on social media, pushing out new journal articles and news as I see it. I also have a lot going on my YouTube channel. I do a podcast. So please, if this content interests you, please connect with me. I'd love to help keep you in the loop. So with that, happy to take a couple questions.
Yep. If we have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, or you can just put them in the chat, and Sherilyn will read them off to us and we'll answer them as best we can.
Yeah, Erin, I have a question that has come in about an adult sibling. So would you recommend less contact, even though it's a sibling, but with an adult sibling who does habitually daily vape marijuana? They don't live in the house, but what's your suggestion on a relationship like that?
That's a really tough situation, I know. So my general approach that I take when working with young people is to educate them and then let them know that they're going to have to make their own choices, and to frame it that way. I think it's really hard to draw a boundary between one sibling and another, if not maybe even impossible. It's a point well taken about how if you're around that pervasive environment, around that normalization, it might be a lot easier for that to trickle down. And maybe depending on the family situation, there would be some benefit to that. I don't know. I definitely can't give you advice on that. But what I can say is that they're going to have a lot of opportunities to vape or to use THC throughout their high school years. They're going to have to say no probably a lot of times. And even after they're out of the house and you can't potentially help shield them, they're going to have to make those same choices. As was mentioned, I went to school down at the University of Illinois downstate. And there's a news article just came out this week about how next to one of the main campus town bars, they're opening a pot dispensary, which is, again, actually pot and alcohol mixed, not a good idea for other reasons we haven't talked about today. But when you talk about availability, right, and what legalizing marijuana does and the influence of it on college culture and everything else, they're going to have to make smart choices. And so I think the most important part is that they know what this can do to them, how it can be permanent. Again, it's not about scare tactics, it's just about reality. And that's, again, when I do assemblies, that's the point that I try to make, is that just know what you're doing. And if you think it's worth it, okay. But you need to understand what the implications are and not get fooled by the rich people trying to get richer at your expense. So that would be my one recommendation at the very least, is educate. And beyond that, you have to make the decision that's best for your family.
Great, thank you. We've had one request for information, so I've got that email contact information, so we'll be sure to get that information out. And if there's any other questions, please feel free to type in the Q&A or in the chat. I don't see any new ones coming in just yet, but we can give it one more minute.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to stick around a little longer.
Erin, this is a question that I have. E-cigarettes and vaping are in fact the exact same thing. Is that a true statement?
Almost. So it's kind of like a square and a rectangle situation. So vaping, so e-cigarettes are nicotine. Vaping can be either nicotine or THC.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
I know an adult who I see with an e-cigarette or something like that, and I thought, are they really vaping like an adult in my circle? Yeah. So it's interesting to know.
Yeah. Yeah. You'll see it sometimes. It's just for adults, it's a little bit more rare. Did I see another thing come in here?
There was,
Let's see, on Q&A, I don't have any new questions. A question about are many ignoring this topic? And that's a question that could be very true, I would imagine.
What I will say about that question is that oftentimes the people who tune into these sorts of webinars are people who are interested and who care and who are responsible parents. And it's great and important that you're here as part of why you're helping keep your kids healthy. And there's a whole group of parents who are not like you, who also probably really need this message. And I think that that's part of what the difficult aspect of prevention is that the folks maybe who really even need it the most are less likely to seek it out, maybe because they're trying not to hear information that conflicts with their own attitudes or any number of different reasons. But it is an important issue. That's why we're having the webinar tonight. And as much as we can talk about this and make this public discourse, in my opinion, the better.
yes. And also in School District 205, for the high school students, they will be backed up in their PE classes with a similar message that Dr. Weinert recorded, and they'll be hearing throughout their PE classes this week. So with that, since we have no other questions, Dr. McBride, would you like to wrap up and say a few words?
Yeah, I would. And I think that's a great question because my experience, I've been in upper administration now for many years, 20 years plus. And I think that comment in the chat about people ignoring it, I find that there are sort of waves. And unfortunately, in so many communities, what draws the attention is a very negative outcome. So those of you who are on today getting information, be a multiplier. Sometimes it's hard for us as adults. There was a time when we were talking to other adults about, do you use cloth or do you use Pampers? What kind of stroller did you get? What pediatrician you go to? When our children were much smaller, we had no problem talking about wipes. But as they get older, we tend to not talk to each other as much. And what I would really challenge everyone who is on this call tonight, engage another adult, tell them what you learned, encourage them to talk to others as well, because that kind of vigilance is ultimately what helps us avoid finding ourselves in a situation where an outcome none of us ever wanted for a young person becomes an outcome. So just being here, like Dr. Weiner said, grateful for you being here. We are always trying to do our homework here at Lockport Township High School District 205 because we know you're doing your homework at home. So thank you so much for this evening. And thank you, Dr. Weiner and KidsMatter.
Yes, thank you so much. And everybody have a great evening. If you need any more information, please don't feel free to reach out to Dr. Weinert or to KidsMatter or to Dr. McBride. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.